Bé, bona tarda, molt agraïda.
Good afternoon. I am extremely grateful for having been invited to tell you about Alexandre de Riquer. This is the great guest for this year's Modernist Fair. There are many different sides of his personality, and in my conference I would like to talk about Alexandre de Riquer for those who know him and also for those who don't. And I will introduce a few things that might be surprising even for those who know about Alexandre de Riquer.
El dia 13
On the 13th of November,
el dia 13 de novembre
on the 13th of November 1920,
va morir a Palma
Alexandre de Riquer y Inglada died in Palma de Mallorca in his house called El Terreno.
de l'any 2020.
Last November 2020, the year of the pandemic, which is we're still in the aftermath of that pandemic, marked the 100th anniversary of that relatively premature death. Without any prior disease, the death of the artist was rather sudden when he was about to go out to the forest to paint.
Aquell mes de novembre,
On that month of November,
1920,
we're talking about 1920, Alexandre de Riquer had just turned 64, actually in May.
1917, Riquer s'havia
Since 1917,
autoexiliat a Palma.
Riquer had gone into exile in Palma for voluntary reasons, and some of his friends and followers, artists such as Joaquim Renard, wrote that Alexandre de Riquer decided to move away from the Catalan capital as he was disappointed with the
Molt espurnejant,
noucentista environment, which was on the rise, who rejected the kind of modern art that modernists such as Riquer had cultivated. Such an outburst would not appear until the 1930s, with pictorial revolutions such as that led by Joan Miró. So, following the invisible law of pendulum, it would seem that to start walking in the first decade of the 20th century, being down to earth and putting the house in order was a must. Alexandre de Riquer, a modernist creator with a lively and light-full body of work, stood out amongst his contemporaries, both for aesthetic reasons and also for the fact that he showed a spiritual energy that in the last 10 years of his life was heavily affected by the orderly constraints, which were, in fact, extremely useful to create cultural policies and structures, but which somehow was detrimental to
més etèria,
a poetic
ser més romàntica.
creativity, especially of the romantic and ethereal nature that Riquer had.
I aquí veureu
Alexandre de Riquer
una mica exacte. Alexandre de Riquer era
Alexandre de Riquer was the son of a noble
carlí Martí
rural owner,
i de Comelles, sisè marquès de
a
Benevent,
Carlist leader.
casa d'Àvalos.
He was Martí de Riquer and de Comelles, the sixth Marquis of Benevent and Count of Davalos, of the Davalos family. His mother was Elisea Inglada and Moragas, born from a well-off, cultivated and liberal family from Vilanova i la Geltrú. Alexandre, who was both emotional and mischievous as a child, was the third son of that marriage, Riquer-Inglada marriage. The future artist was born on the 3rd of May, 1856, in the town of Calaf. The landscape in the surroundings of Calaf, plus the warmth he experienced in the manor house of Can Basols, were forever kept in his retina and also in his sensitive heart. This landscape from La Sagarra County, which you can see here in the image,
amb tants replecs
with full of mineral folds and an inkling of mystery in the rolling fields and wild forests, was the paradise of Alexandre de Riquer's childhood, as shown in the stories of his first book, published in 1897. The title of that book was When I Was a Child. This publication, which he wrote when he was in his early 40s, includes his artistic footprint through the drawings that illustrate the texts. Alexandre de Riquer was a total artist. He intended to be so, and he achieved that, just like his admired English pre-Raphaelites, that he just like them, he also wanted to merge painting, poetry, and craftsmanship. Riquer cultivated in parallel and in a highly qualitative way pure arts, applied arts, and literature. So, next to painting, drawing, and engraving, Riquer cultivated the applied arts. He designed jewels, furniture, flower pots, folding screens, and at the same time he was also designing book plates, posters, journal headings, brands, company logos, you name it. And he also tastefully decorated ceilings, stained glass windows, and ceramics. As a writer, he also wrote with remarkable talent different narrations, poems, biographies, and reviews on art and artists he admired. But there's more to it. Alexandre de Riquer was a man of great intellectual curiosity with a shrewd sensitivity. And he was a great bibliophile and a collectionist who was in love of his collections that he was pleased to show to other people as if it were in a museum. He showed around people in his house. His love for books took artist Alexandre de Riquer to combine his creative talents in making books. Books he wrote and illustrated. And one of the most successful examples of this merger was a prose poems books entitled Chrysanthemums, published in 1899. This is an image of one of the drawings in that book, Chrysanthemums. Chrysanthemums is a song to nature, to the running of seasons throughout the year. Here, the poet reflects upon his own journey, making an analogy with the changes in his own soul, which his mood, which was either blooming or then melancholic or dramatic according to the seasons. He also designed the structure of that book, very long, very vertical, and a very original cover. And that book earned him an international award in 1902, London's Book Arts Exhibition. This poetry book, Chrysanthemums, stands out for its floral motifs inspired in Japanese influences, as you can appreciate here. At that time, Japanism was very trendy in Europe. At that time of Riquer's artistic maturity, Japanism imbued his professional and artistic work. Alexandre de Riquer was a great promoter of new trends. He either imported them or created them or exported them, and he had great imagination. Art critics such as Alexandre Sirisi, who was a specialist in Riquer's work, or Eliseu Trench, another art critic, highlight that the Chrysanthemums books published in 1899 has become a great precedent of what we would nowadays call an artist's
S'hi
book.
pot considerar tant pel que fa a l'equilibrada combinació de text
One may consider it is an artist's book because of the well-balanced combination of text and illustrations, plus the fact that he only published a short print run,
convertir-se
something that made more valuable the existing copies, which became the object of desire for
i col·leccionistes.
bibliophiles and collectors.
No serà pas aquest esdeveniment artístic
This artistic and cultural event was not what turned Alexandre de Riquer into a modern man of the 21st century. We must also underline different facets in the rich, multifaceted personality of Alexandre de Riquer. He was also a great animator and promoter of cultural initiatives. He was a great debater and a vocational pedagogist.
han proliferat
In current times, we've seen the
donar pautes per dur a
appearance of many artistic schools which tend to, many schools which have the purpose of offering social and cultural activities. This is something the very Alexandre de Riquer did spontaneously, following his spirit as a pedagogist and also as a debater. The meeting point was his home, workshop and museum, located in Freneria Street, number 5, Freneria Street, right at the Gothic area, the old part of town of Barcelona, right in front of the cathedral. And here we see the very famous staircase that led to Alexandre de Riquer's workshop. This was his home, actually.
dalt, en aquest taller.
And upstairs is where the get-togethers were held.
Aquesta casa familiar d'Alexandre de Riquer va ser una
The family house of the Riquer became a hotbed of social and cultural gatherings around art and literature topics.
al gran col·leccionista
These were opportunities for that great collector to show very proudly and with useful gayness his most recent findings, and these cultural gatherings were also an occasion for small music auditions where new pieces were debuted and presented, theater plays were read out loud, and they became a platform for fruitful conversations presided over by open and highly cultivated free thought. That was a good personal and collective foundation for the progress of humankind, which is something that Riquer, the artist,
optimista i creia.
firmly believed in, being an optimistic man. Since he was very young, Alexandre de Riquer was clearly open-minded, curious, dynamic, a great explorer. Trained at La Llotja Fine Arts School, he managed to embark on his artistic grand tour after overcoming his father's objections.
La mare, Elisea Inglada,
However, his mother, Elisea Anglada, had a mentality more like his son, and apparently she was also quite gifted for drawing, and she always supported him. That's how, in 1879, young Alexandre de Riquer visited Rome, several locations in Italy, as well as Paris and London. His trips to Italy, France, and England opened up his artistic and mental horizons. The young creator became what we would now call a cosmopolitan citizen. And this cosmopolitanism, or universalism, if we may call it that way, was never snobbish.
tal com era Riquer,
It rather showed in a very genuine way through a deep, comprehensive, humanistic sentiment, which was not at all parochial.
en els seus viatges,
In his trips,
retenia el seu bon
Riquer kept his profound knowledge of his own culture which the Catalan collective mind, which he compared with everything that he was constantly discovering in his trips. As a result of this constant dialogue, these comparisons fed his know-how, which he quickly applied to his artistic and humanistic activity. In that way, he gained a unique personality. The love for his place of belonging, the history, and the reference, which in a way shapes the character of people, is something that Alexandre de Riquer always took with him in his backpack when he traveled around different places in Europe. That was a trip for personal and artistic growth for Riquer, who was a vocational, self-taught man. As far as we know from his biography, Alexandre de Riquer took everywhere he went with his sensitive soul. And his soul was enriched with that dialogue between the self and the others. On a personal level, he became a close friend of English artist Robert Anning Bell, to the extent, actually, that he wrote a book on him. And let me make a comment here. This book on Robert Anning Bell, written by Alexandre de Riquer, is the only monograph on this author, actually, on this British author. Sorry, British artist. So, as I said, this open intellectual attitude allowed Riquer to embrace modern attitudes, modern ways of doing, which he immediately applied to his artistic work. Of course, everything was naturally filtered through his own influences. Being respectful, admirative, as well as attentive and very awake, he extended that attitude to his social life. He was very generous and hospitable. Frequent visitors to his house, which was also the museum and the workshop. Let's have a look again at the famous staircase, in this case with his whole family. This is Alexandre de Riquer, and here we can see all his children. So, among different personalities of the time who visited his museum and house, we needed to underline Apelles Mestres, who studied at the Llotja with him, Enric Morera, Àngel Guimarà, Josep Triador, Joaquim Renart, Jacint Verdaguer, who was a great poet, who actually was officiated in his marriage with Dolors Palau González de Quijano, a young Aurora Bertrana, who actually became the girlfriend of his son Emili, a very young Eugeni Dors, and many other young people who walked by his house, museum, and workshop, which became a real academy in the Greek sense of the word. Because in that house, he also taught. He offered an operational pedagogy. He taught engraving. Riquer excelled in the art of calcographic engraving, and he was a good teacher for those who learned that art in the eagle's nest, as Joan Maragall, the poet, called that house of the artist. Actually, in his lifetime, Alexandre de Riquer was also considered one of the most outstanding artistic figures of the Modernisme Català, that artistic style which, depending on the location, is called modern style, Art Nouveau, Tiffany, Jugendstil, Secession Stil, Stile 900, Floreale, or Liberty. Alexandre de Riquer developed his artistic and literary creativity, especially in the turn of the 20th century. Although he had been a brilliant and very capable artist before in the prior decades. his body of work became one of the purest reflexes of those historical times when plastic sensitivities which made up the artistic modernism bursted out with energy and light. For instance, the neo-Gothic style, the stylization of forms, the Japonism, and the symbolist trends. The Riquer's artistic temperament and his deep psychology were able to bind all these different sensitivities very successfully. He was able to merge modern art with traditional art, and he experienced that to the full-fledged by merging his cosmopolitanism with his deeply rooted Catalan feeling. We could say that probably one of the mottos of the time could have been Catalonia and its artists open up to the world. This motto could have been the expression of Riquer's feelings, but it was also a motto for our modernist artists who were working with their local vocation, establishing a constant dialogue with universal trend. They all traveled to the museums and academies of Rome, Paris, London, Munich, or Brussels, which were the homeland of this new art. The Riquer led a premature social, political, and citizens' activism led by the firm Catalan feeling that he had, which intended to raise the profile of Catalonia around the world. In late 1888, and along with Lluís Domènech i Muntaner, who's the author of the staircase you saw in some of the pictures, he became a member of the Catalan League. In 1893, the Riquer also collaborated in founding the Sant Lluc Artistic Circle. And later, in 1900, he was one of the founder members of a Catalan journal, Joventut, Youth. He was its artistic director and art critic until 1901. Alexandre de Riquer, who did not shy out in his collaboration, is the author of the symbolic headline of the magazine, of the journal Joventut. That vision of the world which honors what's old and falls in love with what's new, as the contemporary poet J.V. Fox said, turned de Riquer into an outstanding human and artistic figure. He was a very modern man in his century, but he was also a herald of the 21st century. He explored the limits of art in his field and very often thought out of the box. De Riquer opened up to modernity because he was heavily attracted to it, and Alexandre de Riquer worked vigorously to shape modernity, both plastically and literally, in his own work in a diversified way. And he wanted to use all different artistic disciplines for a core idea, the beauty and the truth. This idea of art embodied in beauty came from the purest and most profound essence of the human being, which trimmed him both in a literary and conceptual way with Joan Maragall, the poet. Despite the aesthetics and ethical differences, and the fatigue of our Western civilization, after 3,000 years, if we count the Greek and Roman culture, Alexandre de Riquer could have said, just like Arthur Rimbaud, that one must be absolutely modern. So, could we maybe say that Alexandre de Riquer was a countercultural of his time, as the young creators of the Beat generation in America in the 20th century, which indeed was highly respectful with the old spiritual wisdom? The visionary spirit of the Riquer did cultivate the avant-garde and the beat generation, and he must have probably signed with them a manifesto complaining about the growth of the mass man in our period, and he probably complained about the alienation of so many men that were unable to follow the pulsion of beauty and pleasure and truth. In a world where so many ugliness, where ugliness was highlighted, and where different fake news took place as a way of corrupting the truth, I'm sure he would have been a member of the Party of Beauty and Truth if he were to live nowadays. Alexandre de Riquer was an explorer and a visionary. He was always one step ahead. He was a pioneer in the field of design, for instance, for modern posters and arts. A humble, powerful way to take art out to the street, as he said. Apparently, in his trip to London in 1894, Alexandre de Riquer was fascinated when he saw the leaflets that were exposed all around the place in shops, and also posters pinned up in stores and store windows and walls of the English metropolis. And he thought that Catalonia should modernize itself with its own posters announcing all kinds of products, be them trips, books, or industrial, commercial, or cultural activities. In his fruitful imagination, the Riquer could see how successful the new and innovative posters would be. Those posters would be the result of the fruitful imagination of their authors. There were many authors in Catalonia, and he thought that they would be able to do really well in that field. That was the case, however. The first period was not easy at all. He was a pioneer in many artistic initiatives, and Alexandre de Riquer, he also decided to work hard to introduce posters in Catalonia. He still had in mind the attractive images that caught the eye of English pedestrians, either in the street or in the tube stations or out in different places. These images were also catching the eye of magazine readers and newspaper readers that he found in clubs and pubs. Eliseu Trenc, one of his experts, said that when he went back to Barcelona, he offered some Catalan businessmen to draft to draw posters for their products for free, but none of them showed any interest. So he had to convince businessmen at the Barcelona public of how valuable that street art could become. So with the purpose of encouraging people and trying to make them aware of the fact that modern posters were part of the visual panorama of streets and squares in large European cities, Alexandre de Riquer offered a conference in 1899 at the St. Luc Artistic Art Circle. There he talked about posters and poster drawers on the occasion of an exhibition of posters that he organized on his own initiatives. His arguments and images had to speak by themselves. The text of the conference was published in a journal called La Renascença on the 13th of May, 1899. In his speech, Alexandre de Riquer made this statement, which dignifies and offers a higher artistic profile to posters beyond the advertisement that they imply. Riquer said, and I quote, "The poster is the graphical expression of current exuberant art, something that does not fit in museums or churches or private homes, and it rather spills over to the street, turning the street into a permanent exhibition for advertisements which fight for the gaze of passerbys and compete for becoming a masterpiece. Here we see some of the posters that Alexandre de Riquer painted, which could deserve a good location in our own home walls. According to the Riquer, a poster is art out in the open, is art out in the street, easy to understand by everyone. It needs no comments, no efforts, no great aesthetic knowledge so that people can understand it and can feel the persistent and durable emotion that they awaken. End of quote. Alexandre de Riquer said that at the conference of the St. Luc Art Circle about the poster and about the artists who were working on posters. He was a great traveler, and he was also, he received many modern journals that he knew well, and he wanted to join the group of poster authors. Actually, a poster is a naked art. Synthetic art is a sort of printed arte povera in paper, though, but it's not less valuable at all in terms of its aesthetics. A poster is an art which needs nothing but good taste and sensitive eyes that would appreciate the impactful design that Alexandre de Riquer appreciated when he stopped in ecstasies when he walked by a poster by his admired Aubrey Beardsley. He saw many of those posters in the streets and in tube stations, and he realized that those posters would leave people marveled in awe, creating that persistent and durable emotion. Same thing that happens with the over 20 posters designed by Alexandre de Riquer between 1896 and 1902. These posters were advertisements for his poetry books, or for Morello pills, or for the St. Louis poultry farms, or for a journal, a Catalanist journal called Juventud. So in the context of poster history, Alexandre de Riquer appears as the author of the first Catalan poster of modern contemporary aesthetics. It's the poster for the third Fine Arts exhibition that was held in Barcelona in 1896. Alexandre de Riquer loved graphic arts and decorative arts because he was sure that daily life had to be embellished and made more noble in all small manifestations. This is an idea of design before design came into being, design as we know it today. Actually, Alexandre de Riquer was a precursor of design and a model for the 20th century. The art of illustration, be it for a collection of drawings for a group, or the capital letters of a text, or the drawing of a headline for a journal or a magazine, or be it the illustration for a book cover, or the drawings that would be published along a feature in a magazine were a fertile ground for inspired artistic execution by Alexandre de Riquer. So, young Alexandre de Riquer, at first, followed a naturalistic style, as we saw earlier on. This is the naturalistic style. However, he quickly moved towards this style, which is much more stylized. And his hallmark can be seen in books, illustrations, in brands, logos, posters, or ex-libris.
Descobert a Anglaterra el conreu de l'ex-libris simbòlic i, per tant, modern,
he discovered in England the use of ex libris or book plates. In the past, they had heraldic motives, but they became different, more artistic, and he promoted them in Catalonia with the drive of Riquer. Actually, book plates became quite popular in Catalonia, and thanks to his own personal qualities in designing and engraving them, actually book plates moved into a golden age, and the consequences can be still felt nowadays. 1993 saw the publication of a book entitled Alexandre de Riquer's Book Plates, and that's a jewel of graphic modernism around Europe. Nobody would doubt to say that many of his book plates are extremely modern, even nowadays. For instance, some of those which are devoted to Paquita, actually Francesca Bonmaison.
O bé, un disseny, evidentment, influenciat...
This design is clearly influenced by the aesthetics of Japonism. And we also see the Japanese influence in another ex libris made on the name of his son, Alexandre de Riquer y Palau, or the very schematic design of a bookplate devoted to Miquel Utrillo. For their originality and modernity, we could also mention other bookplates for F. Soler y Angela Prat, which are at the same height and of the same quality of some of the current engraving artists we can admire in Europe or in Japan. In the fourth months that he spent in London, Alexandre de Riquer became familiar with the proposals of the arts and craft movement proposed by William Morris, which was inspired in the sources, in pre-Raphaelite sources. This stay in London became a turning point for him, and the sensitive and fraternal connection with that movement of symbolist spirit started by John Ruskin and continued with by William Morris, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Edward Burne-Jones, or Robert Anning Bell was a connection that happened in a split second. This is an image of Alexandre de Riquer in London in 1894. Alexandre de Riquer identified with the pre-Raphaelite school, which promoted arts and crafts put at the service of the idea of embellishing daily life. That was something that happened in a very spontaneous way because he had experience in graphic arts and in decoration. He actually practiced that idea. When he went back to Catalonia, very enthusiastically, he became the first representative and promoter of modernism, graphic and decorative arts of English inspiration here in Catalonia. This artistic current, which was so full of ideas and which is currently called modern art or modernism or Jugendstil, is to be understood as a regeneration, not only in aesthetic, but also in ethical and moral terms. As the Romanticists had done earlier, modernists wanted to reconnect the industrialized man with a mechanized brain that we would bulimically call technified brain nowadays with nature. So this connection between between the modern man and nature is something that they were seeking. And actually, in that period, this polarization between man and nature became more and more intense with the terrible consequences we know all about. Because currently, the environment has become a great concern, actually a dramatic apocalyptic concern because natural resources are limited, and if the impact of climate change is not mitigated early enough, experts say that life on our planet, and therefore human life, is at stake. Medical and scientific authorities are informing that the climate emergency is causing an increase of highly lethal respiratory and circulatory diseases, not to mention, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has caused havoc in our daily lives. Well, Alexandre de Riquer was considered an archetypical modernist artist because of his style, character, and thought. He had a universal conception of a universal idea of art. He had a fragile look, as you can see. He was a thin man. He was not heavily built. He looked fragile. He had this sensitive behavior, which could be easily seen in his dark, shiny eyes. Well, despite of that, both his life and his work explained a very lively ingenuousness, full of energy, which was the result of the enthusiastic spirit which merged well with the ideas of the English pre-Raphaelite movement that he embraced. Pre-Raphaelites, both artistically and intellectually, were opposed to the growing mechanization of human life, as they were afraid that modernity would denaturalize mankind. Because it's true that modernity has brought some very good things, but others are not that good. So this movement appeared in the mid-19th century England as an aesthetic and spiritual response to the increasing waves of hardcore materialism and rampant alienation, which filled the landscape with chimneys expelling fumes with highly poisonous substances, poisonous for the heart and the lungs. So those artists were prophets, and they realized what was coming on to us, something that we are currently suffering in our troubled days. This man, who was fully respectful of nature, who was very awake, you can simply read his poems and see the presence of nature in his paintings and designs. This fact that made him a man with ecological feelings avant la lettre. So, Alexandre de Riquer, we could say, was a modern man in the 21st century. He is even modern nowadays. He has a poem entitled Poem to the Forest. This image can be a little bit more enlightening. In his poem to the forest, he wrote an epic poem inspired in the Catalan folk traditions and the Catalan and European collective minds, and he even links with the Arthurian legends. He writes a song to the forest of his ancestors. This poem to the forest was actually a modern piece of art because of the bold ecological spirit that is shown in it. If you read it in parallel, this long poem with 18 chants could be linked to Henri David Thoreau's works, when Thoreau wrote against speculators and forest cutters. And he said, as if people could have no other interest in a forest but to log it. For our modern stressed psyche, especially now that so many forests have already been destroyed, the Japanese have started talking about forest bathing as something that is very good for people's health.
només un artista modernista.
Let's talk about another aspect that turns Alexandre de Riquer not only into a modernist, outstanding modernist artist, but also a very modern man, is what we could call his own declassing. When he was very young, the economic situation of the family was a disaster. His father was a marquis, Martí de Riquer de Comellas. He was the sixth marquis of Benavent, and he was a count of the Davalos house. He was a militant and Carlist leader, and he went bankrupt for that reason. Well, then Alexandre de Riquer, with his friend Apelles Mestres, started to work in 1876 as an illustrator for a number of newspapers and publications of the time. For instance, La Ilustració Catalana and Arts and Letters, as well as a book collection entitled Arts and Letters, which was directed by Lluís Domènech i Muntaner, the architect. For that, Alexandre de Riquer designed very inspiring and spectacular covers. So, when he was only 20 years old, Alexandre de Riquer entered fully in the world of publishing and graphic arts of Barcelona, and he would never leave it. His dedication to pure art, meaning with that painting and drawing, were always hand in hand with their work in artistic crafts and arts. At the time, Catalan society showed a great love for arts and crafts, and this led Eugeni d'Ors, a noucentist author, to write, and I quote, "Modernism is appearing, and here all the workshops of the city of Barcelona, we assume, started a feverish activity that was totally unprecedented." End of quote. Borja de Riquer, the historian, probably his great-grandfather, Alexandre de Riquer, was probably one of the first aristocrats who had to work to make a living. And he did make a living. Well, better at some periods of time than in others, because as people know, in the field of art and culture, work is rather unstable. Commissions arrive whenever they arrive, and exhibitions sell what they sell. So, not even the great artist Alexandre de Riquer could make a living out of painting alone, especially having a very numerous family under his responsibility. His first wife, he had 9 children with his first wife, who died very young in 1899, and then he had another son with Marguerite Laborde, his second wife. He married her in 1911. Here we see her in a painting. So fortunately enough, out of his own vocation and also out of need, Alexandre de Riquer cultivated applied and graphic arts without losing an inkling of his creativity. Actually, each challenge stimulated that creativity. He practiced what we would nowadays call ongoing education throughout his lifetime. He was a great pioneer in that, because he was very curious and was interested in everything that was new. However, he did not join the new cultural currents of noucentism and avant-gardism, because he was very consistent with that. These rationalist movements did not seduce him. And the last thing any creator should do is to deny the soul that is expressing in himself. Well, And artists should also expect his art to be recognized and acknowledged, even if he is living in a landscape that is totally diverse from that kind of soul. We know that Alexandre de Riquer had a very pacifist spirit, and he was not able to understand the belligerence that some young noucentista artists showed against him, especially when he had hosted them so fraternally in his own home.
L'any 1906 ja havia pres cos ferm a Catalunya.
1906, a new cultural and artistic movement takes hold in Catalonia. It's called noucentisme. It stems from modernism. This is one of the most typical images drawn by Alexandre de Riquer.
Deia, doncs, que
And as I was saying, 1906, this new artistic and cultural trend called noucentism takes hold in Catalonia. And, well, in the same way as often children oppose their parents, he opposed noucentism as well. So this change of artistic and conceptual framework really affected Alexandre de Riquer in three different ways. Professionally, well, tastes changed, and he didn't have as many commissions as earlier. The second way in which he was affected is that he was left in the sidelines of cultural and artistic life. And then finally, what he considered were his friends actually left him behind. That's why, towards the end of his life, he was disappointed with the artistic environment of noucentism, which was on the rise. This noucentism was actually very much against very radically against modernist aesthetics, and that's why Alexandre de Riquer decided to move to Mallorca, a sort of a personal exile where he was able to lead a calmer life, and where he was able to practice painting, a style of painting that was more consistent with his intense inner life, which had become slightly depressed in the previous years. If we consider that modernism is a sort of romanticism, these are movements that always have a lot to do with a specific mood and with intangible ideals. And, of course, Alexandre de Riquer had to become sadder. And to that, we should probably add the human drama caused by the First World War, even if it took place outside our borders. De Riquer had traveled around Europe, and I am sure that his heart was divided between the two sides that were in arms. Alexandre de Riquer
els amics barcelonins, a Mallorca va trobar l'estabilitat que necessitava i que un possible...
Alexandre de Riquer missed his friends from Barcelona, but he was able to find the stability he needed in Mallorca. However, a heart attack probably took him too early. On the occasion of an exhibition that was held in the Paris exhibition hall on the 29th of May 1920, he wrote a sort of a credo in the catalogue that was published for that exhibition. This is a poem full of intentions, and it finishes with certain verses that I would reproduce now, and they were written in the Catalan style before the language was normalized by Pompeu Fabra. I believe in the truth of plastic harmony, in the breathable space, distances, and light, in the sublime love of peace, of a beautiful day, and in life, a life that is beauty, art being its perfume. And to conclude my intervention, I tried to underscore the artistic and human sides of the life of Alexandre de Riquer and Inglada, an archetypical modernist at the turn of the 20th century. He was bold, creative, had this regeneration spirituality, and he was a herald of the 21st century. In 1976, at a conference offered in Calaf, the town where he was born, in an homage to Alexandre de Riquer, his son, Josep Maria de Riquer y Palau, talked about the motto his father had: intellectual beauty and spiritual kindness. This motto has been the motto of these 100th anniversary celebrations, and it summarizes very clearly the intimate and powerful light that the artist radiates both in his life and work. This light has radiated in a very effective and operational way, with certain ups and downs according to the fates and fashions for many, many decades after Alexandre de Riquer's death. He has actually become a modern classic because we could say that artistic revolutions, by that I mean changes in aesthetic values, herald, in a way, what will catch on one or two generations later in a wider segment of society, as Professor Raimon Arola wrote in the digital journal Ars Gravis. So, fine applied arts and fine arts students from my generation not only discovered with fascination, surprise, and awe
meravellats els valors estètics del modernisme, sinó que
the aesthetic values of modernism. We actually incorporated them to our designs. Of course, they were stylized and more in tune with modern times. Alexandre de Riquer fell in love with the bold aesthetic arts of Aubrey Beardsley or the symbolist and spiritual art of Edward Burne-Jones. We, in turn, were attracted by the image of Riquer's personal anagram and the figures of the panels that decorated the Industrial Institute of Teresa, as well as the stylized silhouettes and the painted ink chrysanthemums, forest, birds, and trees. Now, on the occasion of this 100th anniversary of Alexandre de Riquer's death, we had the opportunity to review his biography. In that way, we are learning more about his creative work, and we have discovered sensitive and wise trends which were an avant-garde of intellectual movements. So, having a closer look at his life and work, which are so closely intertwined with his personality, we now have the opportunity to raise the profile of the personal and artistic qualities that made Alexandre de Riquer a modern man of the 21st century. And let me express finally my gratitude for having given the opportunity to talk about Alexandre de Riquer to this very fine audience today. Thank you very much.
Si algú vol fer alguna pregunta...
If there are any questions, please feel free to do so.
No és pregunta, sinó més que...
This is not a question. I would simply like to thank you for this wonderful presentation on behalf of all the Riquer family. For a number of reasons, we could only send a small representation of 3 persons, but thank you very much. We would like to express our gratitude for everything that you expressed, which was based on science, but also on a very heartfelt affection. Thank you.
No? Bueno, sí. Pues no hi ha més preguntes. Pues moltes gràcies a tots per l'assistència.
Let me conclude by thanking you for your presence here. Thanks for having come. Thank you very much, Teresa, for your presentation. And let's bring this event to a close.
Bona tarda a tothom.
Sorry, there is a comment here. My apologies for being late. First of all, I would like to thank the curator of Alexandre de Riquer year, Teresa Costa, and I would also like to thank you for having come today. Let me thank all the institutions which have worked and participated in the new edition of the virtual modernist trade fair, as well as in the all the cultural activities that will take place from today on. It's a sort of a yearly festivity with a wealth of activities that will be carried out in this district, especially in Girona and Consell de Cent junction. I would like to thank all the institutions that have made it possible to go out in the street, even if it's for a very small period of time. Thanks to all the institutions who've made an effort for that. And let's try to enjoy our activities in a normalized way in as much as possible. So with this, we would like to kickstart this modernist trade fair. Thank you very much. I just received some news that have to do with the trips around the visits to the different modernist shops. So there are some vacancies. Some people have cancelled their presence. So if you're interested, please let us know, and we can, you can join these visits to different modernist shops around the district. Thank you.